Global tensions between East and West are at an all-time high. Defence spending is being massively boosted around the globe. The question begs, are we entering a new Cold War? Or did we ever really end the last one? As always, you decide. I'm Bintang Bernie, and this is Friday News Review. So, what is a Cold War? And more to the point, why did we actually have one? In short, nuclear weapons. A Cold War is shadow boxing. It's the risk of an Armageddon. When the Soviets first exploded a nuclear weapon in 1949, both sides of the Iron Curtain realized that they had the ability to inflict grievous harm upon each other. For the first time in history with nuclear weapons, you can annihilate an opponent at the touch of a button. The problem arises, however, when that opponent can annihilate you in response with a touch of a button. Think of it, if you will, as an analogy of, say, two heavyweight boxers circling each other in a boxing ring. Let's say you've got Ali and Foreman. Both know that they are totally capable of inflicting damage to each other. They can damage their opponent. But both are also acutely aware that their opponent can inflict grievous damage upon them. So you have this shadow boxing, this lack of direct confrontation, and that is what the Cold War has been, a lack of direct military conflict between the nuclear-armed superpowers, although at times we have come tantalizingly close. Essentially, it would be summed up in the somewhat horrifically accurate acronym MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. America attacks Russia, destroys Russia. In response, Russia destroys America. Russia attacks America, destroys America. In response, America destroys Russia. Therefore, the risk of, if you like, retribution, of being damaged just as much as the damage you're inflicting on your opponent by your opponent tends to negate the idea of actually going to war in the first place. And to some degree, it's been successful in that it has stopped major conflicts since 1945 between the nuclear-armed superpowers, and we haven't had a world war as such. The trade-off, however, has been that the superpowers, always eager to extend their influence, have engaged in a series of proxy wars, regime change, and a massive expenditure on both conventional military forces and black operations. So to the extent we have been living in the shadow of war ever since, and essentially that's what a Cold War is. You're ready for war, you're waiting for war, but it just never really quite happens. And I don't know about you, but I don't know if that's a really successful way to live. Okay, the Cold War, a very brief recap, as it were. End of the Second World War, America and Russia are at loggerheads. America has chosen not to share the technology of the Manhattan Project with its then Russian allies. The Russians are caught very much on the back foot by the detonation of nuclear weapons in Japan. Churchill comes out in 1946 with his famous Iron Curtain speech, and the world is not a happy place. Now, sadly, we came very close to something very wonderful, because on the 14th of June in 1946, a guy called Bernard Baruch, who was influential United States advisor, he presented a plan to the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, stating that if America shared its nuclear technology with the world, the United Nations would ban all nuclear weapons and would oversee the mining and production of nuclear fuel for purely peaceful purposes. Sadly, it never came to fruition. For a multitude of reasons, it fell apart. And then, as I've said, in 1949, the Soviets produced their first nuclear weapon. Then, April 1949, NATO was formed with 12 member states, with 12 founding states. And then, 1955, we had the Warsaw Pact. and the world was clearly divided along lines of east and west. And it culminated in something frightening known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. But here's the kicker. If you go and ask anyone what the Cuban Missile Crisis was about, they'll say, oh, well, you know, the Soviets brought us to the brink of war, of nuclear war. The Russians tried to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. The question is, though, why would they do that? What's often overlooked and is far less known is that in 1958 and 1959, the Americans put nuclear missiles into Europe. They put the Jupiter 2 nuclear warhead missile in 15 of them into Italy and then 15 of them into Turkey. Now, to understand the significance of this, you need to know a little bit about how nuclear détente works. It takes approximately 30 minutes for a nuclear missile to fly from one continent to the other, from launch to landing on its target. These things are incredible pieces of technology. They actually go out into outer space. They're like moon rockets and come back down, which is one of the reasons it makes them so hard to stop. But what that 30 minutes does is it gives the opposing side time to determine, is this an actual launch? Is it a test? Are we getting real information? Is the missile aimed at us? Is this the start of a war? Do we need to fire back? Now, in making decisions which could decide the fate of humanity, 30 minutes is a shatteringly small amount of time. However, it does give you just enough time to take a pause and think about what we should do, rather than a knee-jerk response. By placing nuclear-tipped missiles into Europe, the Americans massively reduced that response time. When the response time goes from 30 minutes down to somewhere between 9 and 15 minutes, the Soviet Union has precious little time to think about what it's got to do. If it detects a launch out of Italy, it's got to start preparing to launch its missiles in response immediately. So by placing these missiles basically on the doorstep, as it were, of the Soviet Union, America had upset the nuclear parity and had actually put the world on a more dangerous footing. When there was a communist revolution in '59 in Cuba, it was a golden opportunity for the Soviet Union to actually restore parity and put missiles on America's doorstep. And it presented another great strategic advantage in that at that time, Soviet missile technology lagged far behind America's, and they had trouble reaching continental United States. As a result, most of their missiles were targeted at America's key allies in Europe and the United Kingdom. Their idea being that those countries would put significant pressure on America not to launch a nuclear strike which would get them annihilated. So, although the Cuban Missile Crisis is often seen as a provocation by the Soviets, in actual effect, the provocation was done several years before by the Americans, and the Soviet response was an attempt, as I've said, to maintain parity. You cut our flight time down to 9 minutes, we'll cut yours down to 9 minutes. And what it did was it made the nuclear powers, specifically America and Russia I'm talking about, it made them realize that they actually had to accept parity if they were going to continue to function and survive. And we'll look at that next. Okay, so we survived the swinging 60s and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we blundered headlong into the 70s, where there was a period of appeasement, and détente became the official policy, and a recognition of parity between the superpowers. Interesting times, the 70s. Nixon went to China, and we admitted the existence of China for the first time, adopted the One China policy, whereby we agreed that Taiwan is part of China, even though ever since then we've tried to start wars to defend Taiwan against China. We also had the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty signed, very important, and it followed on to the SALT Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, whereby for the first time the nuclear superpowers agreed to reductions and limits on their nuclear arsenals. Now, the ABM Treaty was interesting in that was signed in 72 with a further protocol added in 74, which limited both sides to have the ability to defend only one site. Both sides, not surprisingly, chose their capital cities, and politicians love to be protected. But what it did was it stopped en masse the development of anti-ballistic missile shields. Now, you may think that's odd. Why wouldn't you want to have a ballistic missile shield to defend against these horrible weapons, a mushroom dome, as it were, to protect your country? But herein lies the ridiculous anachronism about the whole MAD policy. In order to secure your safety and your existence, you need to ensure that you're able to be destroyed. That's essentially the key to how it all works. If one side is not able to be destroyed, if one side has a complete protection against the other side's nuclear arsenal, well then you have a dangerous situation, an imbalance of power. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, one country which was the sole nuclear superpower in the world. Imagine the influence, the authority, the power that country could project. It would be quite frightening. I'm not suggesting for a moment that if America was the sole nuclear superpower that they would nuke Russia, although, come to think of it, with Lindsey Graham in your government, that could be on the cards. But maintaining parity in nuclear ability also means maintaining parity in your ability to defend against your opponent's nuclear weapons, and that's what the ABM Treaty did. Then moving into the 80s, of course, Ronald Reagan started with his Star Wars initiative to try and actually undo the ABM Treaty and provide America with a shield against nuclear weapons. Then as technology advanced, as we moved into the 1980s, we had the advent of the cruise missile. Once again, that posed a very dangerous threat in that you could have nuclear-tipped cruise missiles which could fly very low, very fast, and initially were virtually impossible to intercept and present a situation, what's called a decapitation strike, where you could launch these smaller, more nimble nuclear weapons at an enemy, knock out their government centres, their radar facilities, their command and control, and basically render their nuclear arsenal useless. Once again, that was a danger. So in 1987, to double check, the INF Treaty was signed, which basically limited the deployment of intermediate nuclear forces in Europe, anything under 5,500 kilometres. Scott Ritter is a good person to talk about with that. He was actively involved in drafting it, so here's your source document to go to there. But once again, as a new technology emerged, a new way to maintain the balance of power, if you like, was provided. Now, fortunately, in 2019, the US withdrew from the INF Treaty. The result of that, you see, this is what happens that people don't think and realize. The result of that was that Russia developed hypersonic weapons as a response to, with the Americans continually withdrawing from these treaties which provided nuclear parity. So if one side does something which gives them a huge advantage, naturally the other side is going to try and come up with a countermeasure or a new weapon. And that is the danger. So there's been lots of developments since the so-called end of the Cold War, but we'll look at the next chapter is, did the Cold War ever really end? So we come to the question posed at the start of the show. Did the Cold War ever really end? If you look it up online, you'll get a date of 3rd of December 1989. I did it. The Berlin Wall fell down. Germany was reunified. Or if we hadn't liked it, we would have said that West Germany annexed East Germany. But you had the period of perestroika and glasnost. And in 1991, you had the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union. But all throughout this time, two things remained constant. The Russian nuclear deterrent remained focused and functional, and NATO remained intact. Now, I question that. If the Cold War had truly ended, would NATO have continued to exist? Because NATO's sole aim, its sole creation, was as a defensive alliance to protect Western Europe against the Soviet Union. This vision, of Russian tanks like a horde of wildebeests in the Serengeti, majestically sweeping over the central German plain to devour Europe. But NATO continued to exist, and In the 21st of December 1991, Boris Yeltsin wrote a letter requesting that Russia could join NATO. And we know now that Putin has announced, of course, everything that we hear from Russia we're brainwashed to believe is disinformation. But based on the fact that Yeltsin wrote a letter and Putin was Yeltsin's deputy, I believe that Putin actually did when he said he asked Bill Clinton, can Russia join NATO? And Russia was continually rejected. Had the Cold War ended, wouldn't NATO have included Russia? And yet they kept them at arm's length. Wouldn't NATO have ceased to function or exist? And yet since 1999, NATO has doubled in size. 16 new states, new nations have joined NATO. So clearly there was never any end to the Cold War. You might say there was a thawing. And particularly during the 90s, when after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia was incredibly weak. Its economy was in tatters. Western companies went in and raped the country of its resources and its money. Huge sums of wealth, billions of dollars were transferred out to the West. Yet at no time did we militarily unify with Russia. Did we allow them into our little club? So my argument would be that at no point did the Cold War ever end. We gave assurances to the Russians that we wouldn't advance towards their borders. Now, if you look online, I did a quick search before I came on air, and all of the websites, and particularly a lot of NATO ones, talking about the famous not 1 inch eastward, and they decry it as Russian disinformation. Because, of course, everything that comes out of Russia now is disinformation. But I looked up online. I thought, I'll go to the National Security Archive. That's America's official archive, right? Let's, once again, source document. I'm going to read something to you. Pardon me, but I think it's interesting. This was released in the 12th of December 2017. US Secretary of State James Baker's famous not 1 inch eastward assurance about NATO expansion in his meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev on February 9, 1990, was part of a cascade of assurances about Soviet security given by Western leaders to Gorbachev and other Soviet officials throughout the process of German unification in 1990 and on into 1991, according to declassified US, Soviet, German, British and French documents posted today by the National Security Archive at George Washington University. Now, is that disinformation? So it's quite clear we gave the Russians an assurance that NATO wouldn't expand, and yet we continued to expand and push towards them. The NATO forces in 1990 were 1,600 kilometers away from Moscow. Today, with the stand-up of the German 45th Panzer Regiment just outside Vilnius, they are now less than 800 kilometers from Moscow. In fact, I've seen posts from the 45th Panzer that they have troops 35 kilometers from the Russian border. And we wonder why the Russians see us as a threat. So the Cold War never ended. What now for the future, though? What does the future hold? Well, we have the classic Cold War tactic, a proxy war. And for anyone who denies that, well, Boris Johnson, stupid buffoon, he was dumb enough to come out and admit what we already know. He stated on radio that we were waging a proxy war in Ukraine. Classic Cold War tactics. As for the future, well, Russia has built itself a considerable nuclear arsenal, some amazing weapons. It's developed hypersonic technology, as I said, in response to our creation of anti-ballistic missiles. And now we have a situation where Ukraine will be destroyed. Ukraine will be left a failed state. Look at everywhere America goes in its Cold War adventurism. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Libya. Look what NATO did to Libya. Libya was a functioning, vibrant economy. We turned it into the world's first slave market. What an achievement. Hillary Clinton, are you proud of yourself? So the future for us is, it's more of the same. It will be détente against the Russians. There will be, tension. There will be proxy wars. Ukraine and its people will be destroyed and left a disastrous, failed state. And then we'll move on to the next area of conflict. And we have now, of course, in the Indo-Pacific, the ridiculous situation where we're continually trying to have conflict with China. That's our new Cold War enemy, our next target once we've finished with Ukraine, which is on the way out. Zelensky's a goner, his country's destroyed, forget it, it's over. Russia has won the war, that will never change. You might have the odd PR stunt blowing up a few planes, that's as good as it's going to get. And now we have Pete Hegseth almost demanding that Australia increase its defence spending. And as I said at the start of the show, for some reason, nations around the world are pouring vast sums of money into defence. The Cold War is in full swing, ladies and gentlemen. And we have now the ridiculous situation where the Australian, I call him the Minister for Self-Importance, Richard Marles, is demanding that China explain why it's building up its forces and its strategic direction. Really, Richard? Let's be honest. I love living in Australia. It's a great country. Militarily, it's a pimple on the arse of China. China has no reason to explain itself to us. And the point being, why does China have to explain its military strategy or its military ambitions to us? Do we ever explain them to China? What right have we got to demand that any foreign country explains its military build-up to us? China has a huge economy and a big population. Those two things combined are what give you a big military. Did America ever explain its military build-up to China? Did we explain to China why we're buying nuclear-powered submarines and put them at ease? And yet they're supposed to come to us and almost cap in hand and say, do you mind if we build an aircraft carrier or two? I think as a sovereign nation, they're entitled to build up any military force they want. And given their history of being far less aggressive, far less adventurous, and far less inclined to deploy that military against foreign nations, unlike us, who have continually gone into conflicts overseas, conflicts which are not in our national interests and which cannot be considered defensive, I don't think that China really is posing the threat that it's made out to be. And yet it's the red menace all over again, although now it's the yellow peril. So the Cold War, ladies and gentlemen, far from having ever ended, has actually continued, and it's gone up a gear, and it will continue to go up a gear. And we need to demand that our governments withdraw from military alliances, withdraw from, this military adventurism, stop pressuring other countries, stop sailing our aircraft carriers up and down the South China Sea, and stop trying to build a new era of Cold War détente, which is dangerous, which is expensive, and which eventually may lead to direct military conflict, and that would be disastrous. This is Bintang Bernie saying, yes, there are two types of people in the world. I fervently advise you to avoid them both. Stay safe, and remember, there are alternatives to weapons and guns. Remember when we used to just talk to each other?